So I think I was very fortunate. I was the middle child of 3 girls, and I was born into a family where my mother came from a family of 4 girls. So the idea of women doing education, women having careers was something that in their family had been around for 2 generations at least before I came. So the idea of wanting to do something and going forward was just expected, rather than many of my colleagues at the same time for whom women doing education was still something that they were pushing for. So it was slightly a different, I think, youth than many people. There was an expectation on me that I was going to continue to be educated, to go to university, and to then go on to graduate school of some kind. The other thing that was perhaps unusual for me as a child, and some of my childhood memories, was being surrounded by the North. My father had worked in the North and continued to work in the North all his working career. And so there were people that came to the house all the time. Inuit who were in Ottawa would stop by and visit. Researchers who were going up north would stop by to visit. So there was also a sense of the North. But interestingly enough, it was not the North that had captured my attention. There's a family story, and you never know with family stories whether they're actually true or not, that when I was in grade 2, I had to write the standard story that you have to write. What do you want to be when you grow up? As if somebody in grade 2 could possibly have any idea of what they want to be when they grow up. So my best friend and I wrote a story together, and we wrote about how she was going to be an astronaut, and I was going to go with her, and we were going to go to the moon, and she was going to explore gravity on the moon, and I was going to dig up the man in the moon. So that was my earliest recollections of the idea of being an archaeologist. And it's a great story. I don't know how true it is. I can't find that writing. But the other thing is that there is also a history of archaeology in my family. So my father had done archaeology in the Canadian Arctic, beginning in the 1930s. But my mother's father and mother also did archaeology in the Sudan and in Palestine in the early 1900s. And so there was a legacy there as well. And I also have a first cousin who's also an archaeologist. So there's also a family history of an interest in the past and things of the past. And I was actually captivated by Egypt. I thought I was going to be, by the time I was in high school, I thought I was going to be an Egyptologist. But when I was 16, I mentioned that there were so many people from the North that came to our house. And in particular, every year, Father Mary-Rousselière, who among the Inuit is known as Atata Marie, who lived in Pond Inlet, Mitimatalik, for many years, would come to our house when he came down south. He loved archaeology, he loved oral history, he spoke Inuktitut fluently, and he believed that there was this very close association with the oral history, the material culture, the material heritage, and the archaeology. He was really interested in looking at that and looking at deep history. And he would come to our house once a year for dinner when he was staying at the Oblate's house in Ottawa, and he would bring with him, and this is something, by the way, if you're an archaeologist, don't listen to this part. He would bring with him some of the finds that he'd made in the summer, and he would bring them to dinner and show them and talk about them before they were turned over to the museum. And this was absolutely fascinating to me. And at one point, he was talking about the fact that he took people with him up north, and I was 16 by this stage. And my father turned around and said, well, Sue's not doing anything this summer, she can come with you. And so I was really, really lucky How many people have that kind of an opportunity drop into their lap? So at 16 years old, there I was. I headed up north, and I had to spend a night in Resolute Bay. And the plane at that time, you had to fly up to Resolute, and then you had to take a little plane into Arctic Bay, to the old airport there, which was very, very frightening, and then over to Pond Inlet. And I think that I also didn't realize what was happening, because when I arrived in Pond Inlet, I was staying in a school teacher's house who was away for the summer, but the person that came to help me, to introduce me to the community, was Hugh Brody, because he was there at the time. So he also introduced me to Simon Anaviapik, an amazing elder who worked with him. And then I spent the summer at a site called Nunavik, which is a very important ancient site where Inuit have history of Tunitjua, the people who lived in Nunavut prior to their arrival, and where there is ancient materials going back in Nunavik to the Dorset period, and not very far away to the Pre-Dorset period as well, so 3,000 years ago. And we were just 5 of us, but 2 of the people with us were from Mitimatelik, one of whom was Cornelius Nutara, an incredible historian, someone who had been writing his histories down. He kept a journal for years and years and years in syllabics. And so the depth of knowledge that these people had, and because Atata Marie, Father Mary, spoke fluent Inuktitut, he was able to share that knowledge with those of us who were there with him who had no knowledge of the language. And so we had this small camp there, visited by bears, the classic stories of the polar, first time up north and the polar bear visits. But really what I remember is that rich opportunity to hear the history from Inuit and experience the excavation, the thrill of digging and exposing, bringing to light these pieces of heritage that had remained hidden in the ground for so long. And that was the summer between high school and my first year at university. And I remember then going down to university, and I had selected going to University of Toronto because at that time, as somebody in Ottawa growing up, there were sort of 3 university choices. You went to McGill, you went to Queen's, or you went to Toronto. And I just happened to pick Toronto. And I got down there, and I remember that having experienced the North and the light of the North and the landscape of the North, the huge skies, and I think that the people that understand that best from people who live down south are people who grew up in the prairies, the big sky country, that hugeness, that vastness that you get, because they're, unlike here where we are here in British Columbia, there are no trees blocking the light that you experience and the views that you have. And really that summer up north captivated me. That really changed the whole trajectory of my life. So while I had been exposed to the North as a child growing up with the visitors that had come to our house, it had never occurred to me that I would work in the North, that I would do archaeology in the North until that summer, until actually going up north and experiencing it. So that was really I think one of the main turning points in my life was that summer with Father Mary up in Nunavut, and particularly at the site of Nunavik, digging up the ancient history, and then also hearing what Nutaka had to say about those pieces and what they meant to him, and how he interpreted them, and how Father Mary interpreted them. And then going to university and seeing how archaeologists who at that time were trained in archaeology interpreted things. And at the time I didn't understand what I was seeing. But I think what I was seeing was a difference between archaeology that was done with an Inuit focus, a more indigenous, what we would now refer to as indigenous archaeology, versus what at that time was the new archaeology, the Binfordian school of archaeology, the archaeology as a science, right? Where you had squares that you went out and dug in a very systematic way, and then you did a huge scientific analysis, and that way that archaeology was divorced somehow from the people. And as I said, at the time I didn't see that, right? I didn't understand that. I just felt that something was strange and different about the way that I was experiencing archaeology through my education at the University of Toronto. And then I had another phenomenal opportunity dropped into my lap that I think never happens to people. But we had Dr. Hurley at U of T was working in Japan and had received a grant. And he decided rather than taking graduate students, he was going to take undergraduate students. And I just happened to be in his class, and he announced in class that he was looking to take 3 undergraduate students to Japan in the summer. And so, again, I had this amazing chance to go and do archaeology in Japan. And so I went for 2 summers with him to work in Hokkaido, in northern Japan, and to experience, again, a very different kind of archaeology, because, again, what you had in Japan was in the area where we were working in and the time period we were working in was people who were excavating what they viewed as their own history. Whereas in North America at that time, most of the archaeologists, as they are today, are non-Indigenous and working on Indigenous history. But in Japan, people were working on their own history. And again, it was something I didn't understand, didn't clue into it at the time, and it's only with hindsight and looking back that I could see how these kinds of different experiences actually influenced the way that I approached work later on in my life. So that was really fantastic, having that opportunity to work in Japan and to see how the Japanese approach this, and also the different way valuation that was given to archaeology, how each community area in Japan had an archaeologist, had the sense that this was a part of them, right? And when you think of how archaeology even nowadays is treated, it's frequently in Canada, it's treated as archaeology is something that's in the way of development. It's not something to be celebrated. It's there's an old village site, which we nowadays, unfortunately, in archaeology we refer to as a midden, right? Which is a very important term in archaeology, but comes from an ancient Norse term meaning a dung heap or a garbage heap. And if you ask the general public, what do you think a midden is, they'll tell you they think it's a garbage dump. So if you view Indigenous history as on the coast here as a series of garbage dumps, middens, you have a very different perspective to it than if you're viewing it as ancient villages full of the narratives, history, stories, both the tangible and intangible history of a people. So I would say that that's part of how I got to be where I am today, were some of those early experiences that I had in my life. So I finished my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto, and I was fortunate I got to take courses with William Irving, who did a lot of work in Old Crow, along with Jacques Cinq-Mars, who was also at U of T at the time. And they were very good in sharing and generous in sharing their knowledge and their understanding, and also in questioning time depth, right? At the time, it was very much the sense that people had only been in North America for the last 12,000 years. That was pushing it. And yet, the work that Jacques Cinq-Mars was doing exactly at that time, the work that Bill Irving was doing at Old Crow Flats, right? Jacques Cinq-Mars in Bluefish Cave were pushing those boundaries and watching them and the struggles that they were having in having those locations accepted as sites of earlier occupation. And again, at the time, not having the knowledge or the thoughtfulness probably to actually think through why were they running into those problems? What was it about the academy that was so adamant that people haven't been here very long, right? That people came across the Bering Land Bridge only 12,000 years ago. And what was it that was blocking us from looking at history in a different way? So I think I had a lot of those experiences perhaps earlier than many of than other people who had the opportunity. And again, as I said, those were just serendipitous opportunities that happened to fall into my lap. I then decided, after finishing my undergraduate degree, which I didn't do well in, right? I actually did very poorly in my undergraduate degree. And I was looking around and thinking about graduate school, and so I wrote my GREs, which I also did appallingly badly in. And I was thinking, now, so if I wanted to go to graduate school, I'm a little bit stuck, because at the time, going to grad school in the States, as today, you were required to have your graduate record examinations, your GREs, and I had done so badly on them, there was no way I would get accepted anywhere. And so I started looking around, and I applied to universities in the United Kingdom. And that also had another great reason for me, which was that I really didn't want to write any more exams, do any more coursework. And you could go straight into at that time, most people went into a master's program and did a 2 years master's. That's becoming less and less the case nowadays, but it was still very much the actual trajectory in North America. You did your undergraduate 4-year degree, you did your master's 2-year, and then you went into your PhD. In the UK, you could go straight into a PhD program. So I went straight from my undergraduate degree into a doctoral program and straight into doing research with no course requirements. Looking back on it, that probably wasn't the best idea, but that's the decision that I made, and that took me to Cambridge. I think, like many, was there another, do you want me to continue, or were there some other questions? Okay, all right. So I think that, like a number of students, you have many different topics that you start working on, and I had always been fascinated by the interplay between oral history and archaeology. And what I wanted to do my PhD thesis on was I wanted to actually do my PhD thesis on Tunitjua. So the very first time I went up north, I was experienced these histories that Inuit have of the people who lived in Nunavut prior to their arrival, and of whom they had these detailed stories, but every time I read them in the anthropologies, they were very short, and there wasn't a lot of detail, and they were also very much the kind of stories that you expect to find. They're like, there were people here, and they disappeared. It's like, yeah, but what are some of the other stories about them? Is this really all there is? And Father Mary had done some amazing work on the Tunit. And so I thought, I will do that for my thesis. And so in 1981, I went up north, and I went to different communities, and I interviewed Inuit elders about Tunitjua, and was able to listen to people. My understanding of Inuktitut was not strong, but I was very fortunate. I started in Igloolik, and I spent 3 months there, and people were so helpful in explaining to me that it wasn't really important that the time that I didn't speak the language. What was important was that the person that I had interpreting for me was someone who understood and spoke the language fluently. And so whichever community I went to, I was very careful to talk to people about people who spoke Inuktitut really, really fluently. And I didn't worry so much about the English. And the interviews were phenomenal, and the deep depth of knowledge that people were sharing was great. And the very last community I went to was Pangnato. And I arrived in Pangnato, and I can't give you this elder's name because he didn't give permission. And I started interviewing an elder about Tunijua. And he looked at me and he said, I'm not going to talk to you. I know where there are wonderful things. I know where there are these stones that Tunijua were very strong people. And in some places there are these lifting stones that could only be lifted by them. And it just showed how strong and powerful they were. And he said, I know where one of these stones are. And I'm not going to tell you where that stone is, because you'll come and you'll take that stone down south and you'll get rich. And I was a young PhD student, and I'm sitting there, and again, it was one of those things that you don't think through at the time, but with hindsight, you look back later, and at the time I sat there and thought, I'm not going to get rich. How am I going to get rich? Right? And I'm sitting there thinking through my head, and I'm thinking, well, it's an archaeological heritage piece. I'm not going to take it away, but even if I did, I wouldn't own it. I couldn't sell it. And it's not until quite a bit later that I started thinking about, but in many ways, yes, I am relatively going to get rich. I mean, look at me now. I'm in a highly privileged position. I'm a professor at a research university in Canada. I have a salary. I have a full-time job. And what have I got rich on? I've got rich on the heritage of other people and on their sharing of their knowledge with me. So that was another, I think, for me, fundamentally important moment in my life, turning point, where somebody said something to me that at the time, I remember thinking, no, that can't be, that's not right. And afterwards I'm thinking through it, even years later, going back and thinking on it and going, but actually, fundamentally, he's correct. I did go away. I did have the knowledge that was shared with me. And it has given me this prestigious position where I am now. And so trying to think through that and think through the ramifications of what that means is something that I try to carry with me in the work that I do now. But that was 1981. So like any good graduate student, I went back, and then I fell into a really interesting issue, which was I was in Cambridge, so in England, trying to get Inuktitut tapes translated. And I found a couple of superb translators, but they were in Canada, but they were very busy, and they couldn't do the tapes. They weren't high enough priority. And so I found myself in a position where I actually had to change my thesis topic, because there was no way that I could do that. And so as a result, I had to then go back and go, okay, so now what do I do? I'm now 3 years into my thesis. I should be finishing up, and I actually don't have a topic. I can't do my thesis with the materials that I currently have on hand, and I can't see when I'm going to have them. So at that point, I will stop now, because the next story takes more than 5 minutes.